Hello, everyone. This is Kevin from Into English Podcast. Welcome to our new episode. If you look at a normal day in your life, there are a few things that always happen. You use your skills, even in small ways. You spend time on different activities, some productive and some not. You consume content, whether it is short videos, articles, or conversations with other people. All of these actions happen naturally, and most of the time, you do not question them. However, there is one thing that usually does not happen. None of these are being monetized. That is the part most people never stop to think about. Every day, you are already interacting with resources that have economic value. Your skills can solve problems. Your time can be allocated differently. The content you consume shapes how you think and what you notice. But in most cases, these resources are used in a passive way. They are experienced, but they are not converted into anything that produces income. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. People often assume that if they are not making enough money, the problem must be a lack of opportunity. But if you look more carefully, the issue is rarely about opportunity itself. It is about recognition. A more accurate way to describe it is this: you are not lacking opportunities, you are not seeing them. Two people can go through the same day, use similar tools, and have access to the same environment. But over time, their outcomes can be very different. One person moves through the day completing tasks and reacting to what is in front of them. The other person starts to interpret those same situations differently. They begin to notice where value exists, even when it is not obvious at first. That difference in interpretation may seem small, but it accumulates, and over time, it becomes visible in results. So instead of asking where to find money, it is more useful to ask a different question. What are you already doing every single day that has value but is not being used in a structured way? Because in many cases, that is where the gap is. Not in effort, not in ability, but in how things are seen.
One of the most important differences between people who generate income consistently and those who do not is not intelligence or effort, it is perspective. Most people look at the world in a functional way. They see things based on their immediate use. A job is something you do to get paid. A product is something you buy and consume. A platform is something you use for entertainment. This way of seeing is practical, but it is limited because it focuses only on what something is doing right now. In contrast, people who are more effective at making money tend to apply a different lens. They do not only look at what something is, they also look at what it could become if it is used differently or placed in another context. To make this clearer, consider a simple example. Two people walk into the same coffee shop. The first person sees a place to sit, a drink to order, and a comfortable space to relax or work. That is a normal interpretation, and there's nothing wrong with it. The second person walks into the same space, but their attention goes to different details. They notice the location of the shop and how much foot traffic it receives at different times of the day. They observe how long customers tend to stay, what items are ordered most often, and how the layout of the space influences movement and behavior. Both people are looking at the same environment, but they are extracting different types of information from it. The first person is focused on consumption. The second person is closer to analysis. And this difference matters because money is not generated from surface-level interaction. It is generated from understanding how value flows within a system. This idea can be summarized in a simple way. Money is a lens. It is a way of interpreting the same reality differently. When you apply this lens, you start to notice that many things around you are not just fixed in one role. A job is not only a source of salary, it can also be a place to learn specific skills, understand how an industry operates, and build relationships that extend beyond the role itself. A social media platform is not only a place to consume content, it is also a system that distributes information, captures attention, and connects creators with audiences. A skill is not only something you use occasionally, it can be positioned, structured, and applied in different ways depending on the context. In each case, nothing in the environment has changed. What changes is how it is interpreted. And once interpretation changes, behavior begins to change as well. Instead of asking what something is for, you start asking what else it can be used for. Instead of focusing only on immediate use, you begin to consider how something fits into a larger system where value can be created and exchanged. Over time, this way of seeing creates a compounding effect. Small differences in perception lead to small differences in how resources are used. Those differences accumulate, and eventually they show up as differences in income, flexibility, and access to opportunities. From the outside, it may look like some people simply have better conditions, but in many cases, the difference started much earlier, at the level of perception. They were looking at the same things, they just saw something else.
Once you start applying this money lens, something interesting begins to happen. You realize that many things you previously ignored or treated as neutral are actually assets. The problem is not that these assets do not exist. The problem is that they are not recognized as assets, so they are never used in a structured way. To make this clearer, it helps to break things down into categories that are already part of your daily life. The first one is time. Everyone understands that time is limited, but very few people think of time as something that can produce different types of economic outcomes depending on how it is used. In most cases, time is spent rather than allocated. That means it flows toward whatever is easiest or most immediate, without much consideration for what it creates over the long term. For example, someone might use their free time in the evening purely for consumption, such as watching videos or scrolling through content. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. However, from a financial perspective, that time does not produce any residual value. In contrast, the same amount of time can be used to take on small freelance tasks, build a simple side activity, or even develop a skill in a structured way. The difference is not the number of hours, the difference is what those hours are connected to. The second category is skill. Many people have skills that are already usable in a market context, but those skills remain informal. They are applied only when needed and often without consistency. As a result, they never become part of a system where value can be exchanged. For instance, someone who knows basic design might only use that ability occasionally, such as creating something for a friend or adjusting a personal project. In that form, the skill remains isolated. However, when the same skill is positioned as a service, even at a simple level, it becomes something that can be offered repeatedly. Once it is repeatable, it becomes transferable. And once it is transferable, it can enter a market. The third category is knowledge. This is often the most underestimated asset because it feels ordinary. What you know does not feel special to you because you are familiar with it, but the market does not evaluate knowledge based on how it feels internally. It evaluates knowledge based on whether it solves a problem or reduces uncertainty for someone else. For example, someone who is fluent in English may consider that ability normal. However, in a different context, that same knowledge can be used for teaching, creating content, or even connecting with international opportunities. The value was always there, but it only becomes visible when it is expressed in a way that others can access. The fourth category is attention. This is one of the most important assets in the current environment, yet it is rarely treated that way. Most people think of attention as something they give away when they consume content. However, attention can also be accumulated and directed. If you consistently create something that people pay attention to, that attention becomes a form of leverage. It allows value to reach more people without being limited by direct interaction. This is the foundation behind many modern business models, where visibility itself becomes part of the economic system. The fifth category is environment. This includes where you spend your time, who you interact with, and what kind of information you are exposed to. These factors shape what you are aware of and what opportunities you can access. For example, someone in a highly active professional environment may naturally encounter more ideas and connections that can be developed into value. Someone in a more isolated environment may have fewer visible opportunities, even if their ability is the same. When you look at these categories together, a consistent pattern appears. You are already surrounded by assets. They just don't look like assets because they are part of your normal routine. And this leads to a key insight. You are not lacking assets, you are not converting them.
That gap between having something and using it in a structured way is where most potential income disappears.
Once you recognize that assets already exist in your daily life, the next question becomes more precise. If these resources have value, why do they not automatically generate income? The answer lies in the conversion process. Value does not turn into money by itself. There is a structure in between, and if that structure is incomplete, the conversion does not happen. A simple way to understand this is through a sequence. First, there is a resource. This can be time, skill, knowledge, attention, or access to a certain environment. Second, that resource needs to become usable value. This means it has to do something specific. It has to solve a problem, create clarity, or produce a result that someone else finds useful. Third, that value needs to be packaged. Without structure, value is difficult to understand and even more difficult to transfer. Packaging defines what the value is, who it is for, and why it matters. Fourth, that packaged value needs to be distributed. It needs to reach people who can recognize and use it. Without distribution, value remains isolated, and isolated value does not enter the market. So the full sequence looks like this. A resource becomes value, that value is structured, the structured value is distributed, and then it is exchanged. If any part of this sequence is missing, the outcome is the same. No income is generated, even if the underlying value is real. To make this more concrete, consider someone who knows English. At the resource level, this is simply a skill. At the value level, it becomes the ability to help others understand or communicate. At the packaging level, it can be structured into lessons, content, or explanations. At the distribution level, it can be shared through platforms, communities, or networks. And once all of these layers are connected, the same original skill can lead to different forms of income, such as teaching, content creation, or even affiliate-based models. The important point here is that nothing new was created. The skill already existed. What changed was the structure around it. This leads to a more technical insight. Value that is not distributed is functionally invisible. If something cannot be seen, accessed, or understood by others, it cannot be exchanged. And if it cannot be exchanged, it does not generate income. This is why many people feel like they are doing a lot, but not seeing financial results. They are improving the resource, but they are not completing the conversion system. They learn more, work more, and develop more ability. But without structure and distribution, that value remains internal. And internal value, no matter how strong it is, does not automatically enter the market. So the real issue is not whether value exists, it is whether that value is connected to a system that allows it to be recognized and exchanged. And that connection is where most people stop too early. At this stage, the key question is no longer whether value exists. We already established that most people are surrounded by usable resources. The real question is why those resources do not consistently turn into income. The answer lies in the conversion process, and more specifically in the fact that this process is often incomplete. It helps to think about this in a structured way. Every form of income follows a sequence, whether people are aware of it or not. It begins with a resource. That resource could be time, a skill, a piece of knowledge, attention, or access to a certain environment. On its own, a resource does not generate income. It only represents potential. The next step is that the resource must become usable value. This means it has to produce a clear outcome. It has to help someone solve a problem, reduce effort, or achieve something more efficiently. At this point, value exists, but it is still not enough. The third step is packaging. This is where many things fail, even when the underlying value is strong. Without structure, value is difficult to understand and even more difficult to transfer. Packaging defines what the value is, who it is for, and in what form it can be accessed. It turns something abstract into something concrete. The fourth step is distribution. Value needs to reach people who can recognize and use it. Without distribution, even well-structured value remains isolated. It does not enter the market, and as a result, it cannot be exchanged. Only after these steps are connected does the final stage occur, which is exchange. This is the point where money appears, not as a starting point, but as the result of a complete system. So, the full sequence is straightforward, but often overlooked. A resource becomes value, that value is packaged, the packaged value is distributed, and then it is exchanged. To make this more concrete, consider a simple example involving language ability. If someone knows English, that is a resource. On its own, it does not generate income. When that ability is used to help others understand or communicate, it becomes value. If that value is structured into lessons, explanations, or content, it becomes packaged. When those lessons or content are shared through platforms or networks, distribution takes place. At that point, the same original skill can connect to different forms of exchange, such as teaching, content monetization, or partnerships. Nothing new was added to the system. The skill already existed. What changed was the structure around it. This leads to a more technical insight that is easy to overlook. Value that is not distributed is functionally invisible. From a market perspective, something that cannot be seen, accessed, or understood does not exist. And if it does not exist in that sense, it cannot be exchanged. This is why many people feel like they are doing a lot but not seeing financial results. They focus on improving the resource. They learn more, practice more, and increase their ability. However, they do not complete the system that allows that ability to move beyond its original context. So, the limitation is not always in capability. It is often in structure.
Once the conversion structure is clear, the next step is to understand how this plays out in real-world systems. Value does not turn into money in only one way. There are multiple models, and each model represents a different way of structuring the same underlying principle. Understanding these models helps clarify why the same resource can lead to very different outcomes depending on how it is applied. The first model is direct exchange. This is the most familiar structure. A person uses a skill to solve a problem, and payment is received in return. This is the basis of most jobs and freelance work. The advantage of this model is clarity. The connection between effort and income is immediate and easy to understand. The limitation, however, is that output is directly tied to time. There is a natural ceiling because capacity is limited. The second model is content-based distribution. In this structure, value is created once and then distributed to many people. Instead of solving problems individually in real time, the value is embedded in content. This content can take many forms, such as videos, articles, or explanations. Once distributed, it can connect to different monetization layers, including advertising, partnerships, or indirect revenue streams. The key difference here is that value is no longer delivered one-to-one, it is delivered one-to-many. This changes how scale works. The third model is productization. Here, value is structured into a fixed format that can be reused. This could be a digital product, a course, or a tool. The important characteristic is that the value becomes consistent and repeatable. Once created, it does not require the same level of input for each additional transaction. This reduces dependence on time and allows value to exist independently of direct interaction. The fourth model is indirect monetization. In this case, value is created in one area, but income is generated from another. For example, attention can lead to advertising revenue, or influence can lead to partnerships. The value itself is not sold directly. Instead, it creates conditions where other forms of exchange become possible. This model is less obvious, but it is increasingly common in digital environments. The fifth model is asset-based generation. Here, something that is owned or controlled produces value over time. This could involve physical assets, digital assets, or systems that continue to operate without constant input. The defining feature is that value is generated through structure rather than ongoing effort. When you look at these models together, a pattern emerges. They're all different ways of doing the same thing. They take an existing resource and place it into a structure where it can be recognized and exchanged. The resource itself is not the limiting factor, the structure is. This is why two people with similar abilities can have very different financial outcomes. One person uses a single model, usually tied to time. The other person understands multiple structures and applies them in different contexts. So instead of asking how to make money in general, a more precise question would be how a specific type of value fits into a specific structure. Because once that alignment is clear, the path becomes easier to understand.
To make all of this less abstract, it helps to walk through a concrete example. Not an ideal scenario, not someone with exceptional advantages, but a fairly normal situation. Imagine a person who has one usable skill, which is video editing. This is not a rare skill. Many people learn it casually, sometimes for personal projects, sometimes for school or work. At the beginning, this skill exists only as a resource. It is something the person can do, but it is not yet connected to any structured system that produces income. The first step is usually the most straightforward. The skill is used for direct exchange. The person starts taking small freelance projects, perhaps editing short videos for individuals or small businesses. At this stage, the structure is simple. Time is exchanged for money, and the income is limited by how many hours the person can work. However, this is only the first layer. As the person continues working, they accumulate something else without always noticing. They gain experience, they see patterns in what clients want, and they develop a sense of what works and what does not. This accumulated knowledge is another resource, and it can be structured differently. Instead of keeping that knowledge internal, the person begins to express it externally. They create short videos explaining simple editing techniques, or they share before and after comparisons to demonstrate the impact of their work. These pieces of content are not directly sold, but they start to attract attention. At this point, a second system is forming. The skill is no longer only a service, it is also becoming content. As attention grows, new forms of value appear. People who watch the content may not all become clients, but some of them may be interested in learning the same skill. This creates an opportunity to structure the knowledge into a product, such as a basic course or a set of guided tutorials. Now, the same original skill is connected to a third structure. It exists as a service, as content, and as a product. Each of these produces income in a different way. Freelance work generates direct payment. Content creates visibility and may connect to indirect monetization. The product allows value to be delivered repeatedly without requiring the same amount of time. There is also another layer that often emerges. As the person continues to create content, they may begin to recommend tools or software that they already use. If those recommendations are structured properly, they can connect to affiliate systems which generate income when others adopt those tools. At this stage, the system becomes more complex, but also more stable. The key point is that nothing fundamentally new was introduced. The person did not suddenly acquire a completely different skill. They started with one ability and extended it across multiple structures. This leads to an important insight. It is not necessary to be exceptional to generate multiple income streams. What matters is understanding how to leverage what already exists. The difference is not in the starting point, it is in how far that starting point is extended.
If this structure is this clear, a natural question follows. Why do most people never reach this stage? The first reason is that many people simply do not see opportunities in the first place. As discussed earlier, without the right lens, most situations appear neutral. A job is just a job. A skill is just something you use occasionally. A platform is just a place for entertainment. If nothing is recognized as having extended value, then no action is taken to develop it further. The second reason is hesitation at the starting point. Even when people begin to see possibilities, there is often resistance to acting on them. This does not always come from a lack of ability. In many cases, it comes from uncertainty about outcomes. Since the conversion process is not immediate, the early stages feel unclear. Without immediate feedback, it becomes easy to delay or avoid starting altogether. The third reason is overthinking. Instead of moving through the process step by step, many people try to plan everything in advance. They attempt to predict the final outcome before taking the first step. This creates a situation where no action feels sufficient because it does not match an ideal version in their mind. In reality, most systems only become clear after they are partially built. The structure reveals itself through interaction, not through planning alone. The fourth reason is a lack of patience. Even when people start, they often expect results too quickly. When income does not appear immediately, they assume that the approach is not working. However, as discussed earlier, value moves through multiple stages before it becomes money. If the process is interrupted too early, the system never reaches the point where exchange can happen. This leads to a broader insight. Information is widely available. Most of these ideas are not hidden, but execution remains rare, not because people are incapable, but because the process requires a combination of recognition, action, and consistency over time. And if any one of these elements is missing, the system does not fully develop. So the gap is not only about knowledge, it is about whether that knowledge is applied in a way that allows value to move through a complete structure. At this point, if you look back at everything we have discussed, there is a pattern that becomes very clear. Most people approach money by trying to add more. They believe that if they want to increase income, they need more skills, more ideas, more effort, or more opportunities. In other words, they try to expand horizontally. However, in many cases, the more effective approach is not to add more, but to extend what already exists. Instead of asking what else you need, it becomes more useful to ask how far one thing can go. A single resource, if it is structured correctly, can move through multiple channels and create multiple forms of income. The key is not the number of resources, but how those resources are expanded across different systems. To understand this more clearly, consider a simple example involving content. If someone creates content, that content is not limited to one format or one outcome. It can be distributed across different platforms, each with its own audience and mechanism of visibility. The same piece of content, when adapted and placed into different channels, can reach different groups of people. At the same time, that content can be connected to other layers of value. It can lead to educational products, such as structured courses or guided materials. It can attract partnerships or brand collaborations. It can also support services by creating credibility and visibility. So from a single starting point, which is content, multiple income paths can emerge. The same logic applies to many other types of assets. A skill can exist as a service, but it can also be expressed as content, structured as a product, and connected to distribution systems that extend its reach. Knowledge can move from being internal to being shared, then packaged and eventually monetized in different forms. When you look at this structurally, the strategy becomes more precise. It is not about constantly searching for new opportunities. It is about identifying one strong resource and expanding it across multiple layers. You begin with one asset. That asset is then expressed in different formats. Those formats are distributed through different channels, and each channel connects to a different type of income. This creates a system where effort is not repeated, but extended. Instead of building separate paths from scratch, you are building one system that branches out. And this leads to a more stable form of income generation, because the system does not rely on a single point of output. If one channel slows down, others may still function. If one format becomes less effective, the underlying asset still exists and can be expressed differently. So the strategy is not complexity for its own sake, it is structured expansion. One resource, multiple expressions, multiple channels, and multiple outcomes. If you step back and look at the entire discussion, there is one idea that sits underneath everything. Most people are not limited by a lack of resources. They are limited by how they interpret and use what they already have. Every day, you are using time, applying skills, consuming information, and interacting with different environments. These are not neutral activities. They are inputs. And depending on how they are structured, they can either remain temporary or they can become part of a system that generates value over time. The difference is not always visible in the beginning. Two people can move through similar routines, use similar tools, and have similar abilities, but over time, their outcomes begin to separate, not because one person is working significantly harder, but because one person is structuring their resources differently. This leads to a final reframe. The question is not where to find money. The question is how much value is already present in your current situation, but has not been recognized, structured, or connected to anything beyond its immediate use. Because in many cases, that is where the largest gap exists, not in what you lack, but in what you have not yet converted. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.